The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, like the entire world had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Lionel Messi stood there, still, his face unreadable, not with guilt or fear, but with a disbelief too deep to register on his expression. The judge's voice, cold and clinical, echoed off the marble walls, sentenced to life in prison. Those words didn't just fall, they struck, like thunder that tears the sky apart. And just like that, the legend was shattered. Cameras flashed. Journalists outside screamed into microphones. Social media platforms flooded with shocked reactions. Across continents, fans collapsed into couches, wide-eyed fingers trembling as they read the headlines. The same man who had united the world through football, whose very presence on the pitch felt like magic painted in motion, was now being branded a criminal. Some refused to believe it. Others began to dig into conspiracy theories. A few, perhaps, too quick to forget, nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed what they always suspected, that no one could be that perfect. But the truth, if anyone had stopped long enough to see, it was far more complicated than anyone dared imagine. Messi had never been a man of scandals. He lived simply, spoke quietly, and preferred the roar of a stadium to the clamor of celebrity. He had risen from the narrow streets of Rosario to global superstardom, not through theatrics or arrogance, but through consistency, discipline, and love for a game that never asked for anything but everything in return. What most didn't know, because Messi never made a show of it, was just how deeply his kindness ran. He had paid for surgeries in war zones. He had sent anonymous donations to villages decimated by droughts and earthquakes. He had helped struggling former teammates and childhood friends behind the scenes, asking nothing in return. He didn't post about these things. He didn't record videos for clout. In fact, most of the time, not even his management team knew what he was doing with his personal money. He just helped, quietly, unconditionally, like someone who understood what it felt like to be small and scared and helpless. But sometimes even light casts shadows. And in one of those acts of kindness and impulsive, compassionate gesture that came from a place of pure heart, Messi had unknowingly stepped into the center of a storm. A wire transfer, a phone call, an old friend, a desperate plea for help. It should have ended there like it always had, but this time it didn't. Now, here he stood, in the eyes of the law, not as a hero, but as a suspect. As someone who had, they claimed, played a role in something darker, something deeper than he could have ever imagined. He didn't cry, he didn't protest. He simply nodded once and looked down as though he was trying to make sense of a puzzle that never should have existed in the first place. The courtroom emptied slowly. A few reporters lingered, trying to capture any angle of his reaction. But Messi didn't give them the satisfaction of a breakdown or a statement. He simply turned around, hands cuffed, and walked out. Not like a man broken, but like a man carrying the full weight of something he didn't deserve. It wasn't the end. It couldn't be. But in that moment, it felt like the world had just witnessed the fall of something sacred. And no one knew yet that behind this tragedy was a truth so profound, so painful, and so utterly human. It would one day change how the world viewed both justice and kindness. The night was calm, but the silence inside Messi's hotel suite felt almost eerie. Outside, the Miami skyline shimmered under the velvet darkness. Neon lights from passing cars painting fleeting patterns across the glass windows. Messi sat quietly on the edge of his bed, lacing and unlacing his fingers. His mind replaying the goals from the last training match. He should have been tired, maybe even proud of another solid day on the field. But something tugged at him, a feeling hard to name. Like a shadow waiting to be noticed, and then his phone buzzed. The name on the screen hit him with a strange, unexpected weight. Mateo Rivas. It had been years, decades even. The last time Messi saw him was during a brief visit to Rosario. They were both just boys back then, Mateo always getting into trouble, street smart and fiery. Not the kind of kid who could talk his way into or out of anything. He used to joke that Messi's right foot would buy them both a better future. Would just laugh and pass him the ball. He hesitated for a second. Why now? Why call after all this time? But instincts overruled logic. He answered. What came through the receiver wasn't the voice of the mischievous boy he remembered. It was strained, cracked, shaking under the weight of something heavy. "Leo, I didn't know who else to call. It's my daughter Isabella. She's only 9. She's sick. A rare blood disorder. We tried everything. Hospitals turned us away. The treatment exists, but it's in Switzerland. I don't have the money." The words fell like stones into a well. Messi's silence said everything: shock, confusion, helplessness. But then, without thinking twice, he said the only thing his heart would let him say: "Send me the account details. I'll take care of it." Matteo tried to protest, stammering something about not wanting to beg, but Messi cut him off. "Just do it right now." The call ended. The text came within minutes. No manager was consulted. No assistant notified. Messi opened his banking app, transferred 1 million euros to the account Matteo had sent, stared at the confirmation screen. For a long moment, there was no second-guessing, no fear, no analysis. Only the warmth of knowing he might have just saved a child's life. But what? Messi couldn't see what no one could was that this account wasn't truly Matteo's. Unbeknownst to either of them, Matteo had fallen into the clutches of a criminal syndicate posing as a charitable medical foundation. Desperate and exhausted, he hadn't verified the bank details. He believed he was talking to the hospital. In reality, the contact he had been communicating with was part of a sophisticated international laundering network that preyed on the desperate. The moment Messi's funds entered the account, a flag went up in a database halfway across the world. A name like Lionel Messi didn't go unnoticed. Intelligence agencies had been watching that account for months, tracking patterns, watching for ties. They didn't know who the sender was, or why the money came. All they saw was a famous athlete suddenly dropping a fortune into a known suspicious financial channel. A red light flashed across an encrypted screen. Messi's name was logged. Meanwhile, he went to sleep peacefully that night, unaware of the gears that had started to turn against him. In another part of the city, agents in suits were already preparing paperwork. The signature on the transfer, his own, was all they needed to build a case, even if it was built on a foundation of misunderstanding. By morning, the silence in his suite would be broken by a knock on the door that would change everything. The sun had barely risen when Lionel Messi's hotel door echoed with a hard, deliberate knock. It wasn't the gentle kind that came with breakfast service or a teammate dropping by. It was sharp, repetitive, purposeful. Something in the pit of his stomach twisted, but he brushed it off. Maybe it was a manager or a club official. He opened the door in his training hoodie, expecting familiarity. What he found instead were 5 men in dark suits, stern-faced, no smiles, no introductions. One stepped forward and calmly said, "Mr. Messi, we need you to come with us. It concerns an international investigation." For a moment, the world around him didn't move. Messi blinked slowly, his brain scrambling to make sense of their words. "Investigation? What kind of investigation?" he asked, still standing. In the doorway, barefoot and confused, they didn't answer. Instead, they showed a document with his name, the account number, the transaction. And then came the words that would ring in his ears for days to come. Suspicion of aiding financial crimes through international wire transfers. It didn't feel real. Even as he was escorted into the car, even as the hotel staff watched. Silently in disbelief, Messi kept thinking this must be a mistake, a glitch, a misunderstanding that would clear up as soon as he explained. He wasn't the kind of man to get involved in anything remotely illegal. His entire life had been football, family, and quiet generosity. But inside the sterile walls of the investigative agency, the tone was different. The investigators were polite, but firm. They presented files, spreadsheets, documents, all of which pointed to a disturbing possibility that Messi had sent large sums of money into an international laundering operation with ties to fraud, smuggling, and trafficking. The money trail was real. The signatures matched. And the worst part, the account had now been directly linked to more than a dozen shady transactions across borders. "Why would you send funds to this account?" one agent asked. Messa tried to explain. He told them about Matteo, about Isabella, about the call, the voice, the desperation. But they didn't seem moved. The more he spoke, the more skeptical their eyes became. Did you verify the account? No. Did you consult your legal or financial team? No. Do you have a receipt from the medical provider? No. I trusted him. I just wanted to help. That's when the world outside began to crumble. News broke within hours, first in whispers, then in roars. Major sports networks aired emergency segments. Lionel Messi under investigation for financial crime, the Cairo in red in bold red text. Commentators sat in stunned silence while analysts tried to dissect a story none of them fully understood. The internet, as always, was less patient. Memes exploded. Accusations flew. Videos of Messi's kindest moments were juxtaposed with theories of betrayal. One viral post read, "Even saints have secrets." His fans were heartbroken. For some, belief turned into denial. He's innocent. They're framing him. For others, it turned into betrayal. How could he do this after all these years of pretending to be humble? Messi's name became toxic overnight. Sponsorships began reevaluating their contracts. Clubs went silent. Even friends in high places hesitated to comment. No one wanted to say the wrong thing, in case it all turned out to be true. Inside the walls of the investigation office, Messi remained quiet. He wasn't plotting a press release. He wasn't calling lawyers to spin stories. He was sitting in a small chair, trying to understand how one phone call, a moment of pure human kindness, could erupt into a global firestorm. And while his legal team rushed to gather information, while prosecutors filed motions and the media prepared for the spectacle of a lifetime, Lionel Messi waited. Not as a footballer, not as a hero, but as a man caught in a storm he never saw coming, a storm born not of malice, but of compassion. One act of kindness had cracked open a hole in his world, and the wind rushing in was louder than anything he had ever faced on the field. The trial arrived like a tidal wave, swallowing everything in its path: reputation, admiration, trust. For days leading up to it, the world watched in anxious anticipation, as if the fate of not just a man but a symbol was about to be decided. Lionel Messi wasn't just a footballer on trial. He was an idea, a global icon, a man millions looked up to as a beacon of humility and brilliance. Now he stood behind a thick pane of glass in a courtroom brimming with tension. His silence louder than any plea he could make. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the frenzy. Dozens of artists sketched his every blink. Reporters described his posture like he was a statue carved from betrayal. Outside the courthouse, protesters and supporters shouted over each other, their voices clashing like rival chants at a derby match. Inside, the air was heavy with judgment, not from the judge, but from the thousands of invisible eyes watching from screens across the globe. The prosecution began methodically. Their tone was devoid of drama, but each word carried a surgical precision, as though they were slowly peeling back the layers of Messi's public image. "This is not about football," the lead prosecutor said, pacing before the jury.
Oh.
"This is about accountability. It is about someone who used his global influence to conduct quiet transactions under the radar, supporting accounts that had been tied to a network of international fraud and criminal laundering. Charts were shown, bank statements, names of account holders that Messi had never heard of, photographs of shady individuals receiving money from the same financial route Messi's transaction had entered. The implication was hauntingly clear. Even if Messi didn't intend to be involved, he had participated. And ignorance, they argued, was not innocence. Then came the recording's wiretapped calls, surveillance footage, conversations between individuals in the network. Messi wasn't in any of them, but the narrative was carefully crafted to place him dangerously close to the edge. How can a man of such resources and counsel act without due diligence? The prosecutor asked. Is it not suspicious that he bypassed all formal channels to send money? Is this the behavior of a well-meaning friend or someone trying to keep things hidden? The defense rose slowly, visibly carrying the weight of an uphill battle. They didn't offer theatrics. Instead, they leaned into Messi's history, his years of charitable giving, his avoidance of drama, his simplicity. Lionel Messi is not perfect, the defense lawyer said plainly. But he is honest. And above all else, he is human. The courtroom was shown evidence of other donations Messi had made anonymously over the years, payments to cancer clinics, 2 struggling youth centers, 2 earthquake relief funds. None of those recipients had official paperwork when the money arrived. He gave because someone asked, because someone needed help. This case, the lawyer continued, isn't about criminal intent. It's about a man whose compassion was used as a doorway by others. They brought in character, witnesses, former teammates, coaches, doctors, people from Rosario. They spoke not of his talent, but of his heart. Of the boy who bought new cleats for his teammates when their souls gave out. Of the man who funded the rebuilding of a school that had burned down in silence, never once asking for his name to be added to the plaque. But in court, emotion doesn't always win over logic. As the closing arguments ended, the jury sat motionless. The judge looked solemn, still dressed in his tailored black suit, sat quietly with his hands folded, staring ahead not with fear, but with the calm of someone who already knew how the story would end. For all his fame and all his generosity, he had no defense against how the system perceived him, a man with power, and therefore a man expected to know better. Hours later, the verdict came and guilty. The word felt like a blade. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no gasp. Just stillness. A kind of emotional paralysis that fell across every person present. Messi didn't flinch. He stood when asked, nodded slightly, and accepted the sentence. Life in prison, not because he schemed, not because he lied, but because he trusted. And in that trust left a door open for the wrong people to enter. In that moment, Lionel Messi was no longer just a player who dazzled on fields across continents. He became a cautionary tale. A man whose heart had led him down a path his mind never questioned. And as he was escorted out, the world wasn't just watching a legend fall, it was watching a tragedy unfold. A tragedy born not of evil, but of goodness turned against itself. Asterisk inside the high-walled prison. Surrounded by barbed wire and steel gates, Lionel Messi entered a world that didn't care about golden boots, Ballon d'Ors, or the roar of 80,000 fans chanting his name. In here, no one wore jerseys with his number on the back. In here, his past glory was just a rumor floating among men who had long buried their own stories. And yet, even in this world of concrete and consequence, Messi carried something with him that couldn't be taken by a verdict: his dignity. From the very first day, he rejected isolation. The authorities had offered him a private cell, extra privileges, protection from others. He declined. "I'll stay where everyone else is," he said simply. He chose to eat what they ate, sleep in the same bunk beds, share the same open showers. There was no entourage, no special treatment. Just a man, quiet and unassuming, stepping into a life stripped of fame. But it didn't take long for the atmosphere to change. At first, many inmates kept their distance. Whispers followed him like shadows. Some thought he must be guilty of something monstrous to end up there. Others didn't believe it was really him. The man who danced past offenders like they were blades of grass now shuffled in line for food with a plastic tray and a blank stare. But slowly, as the days unfolded, so did something else dash respect. It began when he picked up a stray football someone had crafted from worn-out socks and tape. A few younger inmates were kicking it around the yard. Messi didn't say a word. He just passed it back with a smooth touch that made time pause. The boys stood still for a second, then their faces lit up. Word spread like wildfire. Messi played in the yard. By the next week, the prison's dusty recreation area had transformed. Inmates, some of them hardened, dangerous, violent, showed up to kick a ball, not to fight. Rival gangs laid down their grudges, even if just for 20 minutes of peace and sport. And at the center of it all was a man who said little, smiled rarely, but gave everything he had to a game that never betrayed him. He didn't just play, he coached. He taught men twice his size how to dribble, how to pass without looking, how to communicate with movement instead of words. And off the field he did more. One afternoon he noticed an older inmate sitting alone with a torn book. The pages were covered in markings. Messi sat next to him. The man confessed he never learned to read properly, that he was ashamed. Nodded and said, "Let's learn together." By the next month, they had formed a small reading group in the corner of the prison library. It wasn't official. There were no certificates. Just one man helping others reclaim a piece of dignity they thought was lost forever. Guards started to notice a shift. Fights decreased. Prisoners volunteered to clean their blocks. One even asked to donate his commissary snacks to someone who didn't have family sending money, and when asked why, he said, "Messi gave me his bread the other night without saying a word. No one's ever done that for me." In the darkest place he had ever known, Lionel Messi's light began to shine brighter than it ever had under stadium lights. Not because of fame, but because of the quiet choices he made every day to be kind, even when the world had called him a criminal. He wasn't trying to change the prison. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just being who he had always been, a man who led with heart. And as time passed, a strange thing happened. The inmates stopped calling him Messi. They called him Coach, Brother, Leo. Not because they forgot who he was, but because they finally understood who he really was. This was no longer a place where his career had ended. It had become a place where his humanity began to ripple outward, subtle, powerful, and unstoppable. The truth, as it often does, did not arrive with trumpets or flashing headlines. It came quietly like a whisper in a store, unexpected, almost. Too late. Somewhere in Barcelona, inside a dimly lit apartment crowded with old documents and blinking monitors, a weary journalist named Alejo Cruz sat hunched over his laptop, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. He wasn't looking to save anyone. He was chasing a different story entirely. One about missing funds in a failed European aid organization. But as he cross-referenced bank accounts and donor names, a familiar one caught his eye. Not because of its fame, but because of its inconsistency. It was the same account Lionel Messi had wired money to. The one at the heart of the conviction that had silenced stadiums around the world. Alejo didn't jump to conclusions. He had been a journalist too long to trust coincidence. But something didn't sit right. The account's metadata didn't match standard hospital protocol. The timing of transactions seemed manipulated. Over the following weeks, he dug deeper, tracing emails, spoofed numbers, and digital breadcrumbs left behind by careless hands. Then he found a tan, internal whistleblower from the fake medical foundation. Someone who had been trying to get their story heard for months, but had been silenced by fear. With encrypted messages and documents in hand, Alejo connected the dots. The organization had run a network of scam charities targeting celebrities and philanthropists, posing as desperate parents, doctors, and crisis workers. Their targets were usually generous, quiet, and not overly involved in the back end of their donations. Messi fit the mold perfectly. The kicker, Mateo Rivas's childhood friend, had never knowingly been part of the fraud. He had sent the original message under real distress, but the account he'd provided had been intercepted and swapped by the syndicate. Mateo himself was a pawn armed with this. Alejo didn't release a headline. Took it to Messi's legal team first, then to the authorities. Then, when the facts were verified and the case was officially reopened, he finally published his article, Lionel Messi, The Price of Compassion. The world stood still again, but this time, in awe, major news outlets reversed course, issuing public apologies and dedicating hours of coverage to what was now being called one of the gravest misjudgments of modern justice. Commentators, who had once speculated about Messi's guilt, now fumbled for words. Fans took to the streets, not in protest, but in celebration, because the man they believed in had never stopped being who he was. Inside the prison, the news spread like wildfire. Inmates cheered. Guards offered handshakes. The warden himself walked down the corridor to Messi's cell with tears in his eyes. "You never belonged here," he whispered. Within hours, Messi's team filed for an emergency appeal. The courtroom packed once again, this time buzzed with a completely different energy. Journalists didn't stand outside the building, they rushed in, desperate to witness a wrong being made right. When Messi walked in, his appearance hadn't changed much, still modest, still composed, but his eyes told a different story. They held pain? Yes. but also a peace that comes from enduring something without losing yourself to it. The judge's tone, too, had changed. No longer clinical or detached, but almost apologetic. After reviewing the new evidence and confirming the manipulation behind the fraudulent account, the judge addressed the room with a heaviness that only truth can bring. This court acknowledges a failure not just of process, but of perception. Mr. Messi, you have suffered an injustice no human being deserves. On behalf of this institution, I offer our deepest apologies. You are hereby exonerated of all charges. You are free. There were no cheers inside, no clapping, just silence, sacred, as if the moment itself knew it was witnessing something bigger than freedom. Messi nodded politely, thanked the court, and walked out not with triumph, but with humility. Cameras flashed, reporters yelled his name. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. Simply stepped into the sunlight, looked up at the sky, took his first deep breath as a free man again. Not everyone gets a second chance at life, but Lionel Messi didn't just get one, he earned it, and he would never waste it. Asterisk freedom felt different this time. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the dramatic comeback the world had expected. Lionel Messi didn't emerge from prison with a press conference or a social media video thanking his supporters. There were no dramatic montages, no immediate brand deals, no stadium tours to reclaim his crown. When the gates opened and he walked out, he carried only a small bag and the same quiet composure he had the day he went in. Reporters swarmed. Helicopters circled overhead. He walked through it all like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to reflect on. He didn't go back to football. Not right away. The clubs called, of course. The offers flooded in, some from Europe, some from Asia, others from billionaire-owned teams promising blank checks for his return. One even offered to build a stadium in his name. But Messi said no, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, simply because he wasn't ready to wear the number 10 again, not until he had healed, and not until the world had learned to see him as more than a player. So he disappeared. Weeks passed, then months. The media speculated wildly. Some claimed he was writing a book. Others said he was seeking spiritual peace in the mountains. In truth, he was doing something no one expected. I was traveling not. 2 famous cities or private beaches, but 2 forgotten towns, broken villages, and quiet corners of the world that had never known the sound of roaring crowds. He moved in silence, often unrecognized, sometimes sleeping in modest shelters, visiting refugee camps, orphanages, remote schools with leaky roofs and bare classrooms. He came not with money or cameras, but with time, with presence. He sat with children and told them stories. He played barefoot with kids who had never touched a real football. He ate with families who had lost everything and asked for nothing. Word of his visits began to leak slowly. But even when it did, Messi refused to let it become a movement or campaign. He wouldn't let his face be used on donation posters. If you want to help, he said to those who asked, just do it quietly, like the people who helped me when no one else did. Somewhere along the way, his story shifted. He was no longer the prisoner who had been wrongfully sentenced. He became a symbol of grace, of how to respond to pain without turning bitter, of how to walk through injustice and still choose to give. People began to see that his greatest act was not his return to freedom, but what he did with that freedom. He didn't seek revenge against the system that failed him, didn't sue the court, he didn't launch an expose. He forgave. And then, one day, a journalist caught up to him outside a small community center in Morocco. The man asked, "Do you ever regret helping that friend? Sending that money?" Messi paused for a long time, looking out at the children playing on the dusty field behind him. Then he replied softly, "No. If I had the chance again, I'd still help him, even knowing everything that would follow. Because if we let fear stop us from helping people, then what are we even playing for?" Years passed. He eventually returned to football not as a player, but as a mentor. He built youth academies not for profit, but for purpose. He opened schools where football was taught alongside empathy, humility, and community. His name, once worn on jerseys for his goals, was now spoken in classrooms for his values. And perhaps the most beautiful part of it all was, this people no longer just admired Messi for what he did on the field. They admired him for who he became off of it. His story had evolved from legend to legacy. He wasn't just the man who beat defenders with elegance, he was the man who beat injustice with kindness. He showed the world that a career might earn you applause, but character earns you something far greater respect, not from the crowd, but from humanity itself. And in doing so, Lionel Messi didn't just reclaim his freedom, he redefined it.